All right, y'all having a good time today? Good old technical difficulties, I'll tell you what. I'm a little tired, actually. I just got back from a family reunion down there in Arkansas. We were down there in Elevated Mattress, Arkansas. Now, if you don't know where Elevated Mattress, Arkansas is, that's just above Mammoth Springs. But we had a good time down there, and I was a little disappointed, though, because my mama couldn't come. She retired last year and moved to one of them retirementation communities down there in Florida. I did get to talk to her on the phone, though. I said, "Mama, how you doing?" She said, "Leroy," she said, "I tell you what, this getting old ain't no fun." She said, "My reaction time's so slow anymore." She said, "I can hardly see." She said, it's terrible." She said, "But thank the Lord, I still got my Florida driver's license." I did get to see my cousin Jim Bob, though. I hadn't seen him in a long time, and it was good to see him. You know, I found out he got married. I couldn't believe it. I didn't think he'd ever get married. And I said, "Where's your wife?" He said, "Well, she couldn't come with me." I said, "What's her name?" He said, "Bureau." I said, "Bureau?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Son, don't you know a bureau's a big old thing with drawers about this wide?" He said, "Yep, that's my bureau." But he said that he was on his way up to the family reunion, and he had one of them cellulite phones, and said that thing started ringing. It was his wife calling him. She said, "Jim Bob, be careful. There's a big report on the news right now. There's some idiot driving the wrong way on the freeway." He said, "Well, you ain't telling me nothing. There's hundreds of them." He never was the sharpest knife in the drawer, I'll tell you. But I asked him if he was doing anything for a living these days. He said, "I've worked several jobs here pretty recently." He said, "I was working at a fire hydrant plant. They make fire hydrants." He said, "But I couldn't work there very long because you couldn't park anywhere near the place." He said, and then he got a job at a meat factory, and he backed up too close to a slicer and got a little behind in his work, and they fired him. Yeah, I tell you, old Jim Bob, he's something else. We used to do all kinds of stuff together. I remember we was out hunting one time, and we came across this big old hole in the ground, and it looked like an old well or something, and I said, "Well, I wonder how deep that thing is." Jim Bob said, "Well, there's only one way to find out. Let's throw a rock down in there and see if we can hear it hit, you know." So we did. We found a rock, threw it down in there and listened. Never did hear it hit the bottom. I said, "Well, maybe we can get a bigger rock and try that." So we looked around, found us a bigger rock, and threw that off in there, and still didn't hear it hit the bottom. I said, "Man, that thing must be deep." So we was looking for an even bigger rock, which we couldn't find, but we did find an old railroad tie. So we each grabbed an end of that railroad tie. We took it over there and threw it off in there and was standing there listening. And all of a sudden we heard a noise, and we jumped back because a goat came out of nowhere and jumped off in that hole. We was wondering what that was about, and a guy walked up and said, "Hey, you fellas ain't seen a goat around here, have you?" We said, "That's funny you should ask. We just saw one jump in that hole right there." He said, "No, that couldn't be my goat." We said, "Why not?" He said, "Because I got my goat tied to a railroad tie." We didn't want any part of that. We just got on out of there, I'll tell you. I remember we used to work together on some different jobs. There was one time we was out working. It was the middle of August. It was hot. Sun was beating down. We was digging a ditch. It was hard work, you know. All of a sudden we realized our supervisor was sitting up there taking it easy under a big old oak tree. Jim Bob was getting mad. He said, "Hey, how come he's taking it so easy? We're working so hard down here." I said, "I don't know. If it bothers you that much, go ask him." So he said, "Well, I will." He went up there and he asked him. He said, "Hey," he said, "how come Leroy and I are down here working so hard? You're up here taking it so easy?" He said, "Well, son, that's because of intelligence." Well, Jim Bob never heard that word before, intelligence. He said, "Intelligence? What is intelligence?" The guy said, "Well, I'll tell you what, it'd be easier if I just show you." He went over, he put his hand up against that big old oak tree. He said, "Now, Jim Bob, I want you to hit my hand as hard as you can." Well, Jim Bob was already upset. You know, he said, "All right, you bet I will." You know, he drew back and he swung. Just as he was about to connect, the supervisor moved his hand out the way. Jim Bob smacked his knuckles on that tree, busted them all up, you know. Supervisor said, "Now that, my boy, is intelligence." Well, Jim Bob came back down there, and I said, "Well, what'd he say?" He said it was because of something called intelligence. Well, I ain't never heard that word either, you know. I said, "Intelligence? What's that?" Jim Bob said, "Well, it might be easier if I just show you." He said, "Here, hit my hand as hard as you can." But I'll tell you what, there was another time we was working, we both got laid off at the same time. We went down there to that unemploymentation office, and I was talking to the lady there, and she asked me first. She said, "All right, Leroy," she said, "now what is it you do for a living?" I said, "Well, ma'am," I said, "I'm a diesel fitter." She said, "Okay." She looked that up in her little book. She said, "Diesel fitter." She said, "That's considered skilled labor." She said, "Leroy, you're going to get $250 a month." Well, that sounded fine to me. I said, "Okay." She turned to Jim Bob. She said, "Now, Jim Bob, what is it you do?" Jim Bob said, "Well," he said, "I make ladies' undergarments." She said, "Well, ain't nothing wrong with that. Textile manufacturing." She said, "But that's considered unskilled labor." She said, Jim Bob, you're going to get $125 a month. Well, Jim Bob was upset. He said, how come Leroy gets $250? I only get $125. We both work at the same place. She said, well, I can just go by what my book says. You know, she said, Leroy told me he was a diesel fitter. That's skilled labor. He said, what skilled labor? He said, I make the undergarments, and Leroy holds them up and says, yep, diesel fitter. He told me he got him a couple dogs, and I said, really, what kind of dogs? He said, well, they're German Shepherds. I said, what'd you name them? He said, Timex and Rolex. I said, well, that's kind of weird. What'd you name them that for? He said, duh, they're watchdogs. Yeah, that's a groaner, I know. He said they had puppies the other day, and I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, I had 3 of them. I said, what'd you name them? He said, well, Thunder and Lightning and Liberace. I said, what'd you name him that for? He said, well, Thunder because he's always a barking, Lightning because he's here, there, and everywhere, and Liberace because he's the pianist. Now, I'll tell you, we went into town. We was going to do some cutting out there on Uncle Charlie's farm while we was down there at that reunion, and we heard about this new thing called a chainsaw. We never used them. We use them old bow saws, you know. You just cut the tree down, everybody gets on one end of it and just cuts away. Well, we went into that hardware store, and that guy said, yeah, he said, these chainsaws are guaranteed to cut 30 trees a day. Well, we were like, 30 trees a day? We ain't never cut 30 trees in one day. He said, well, I'll guarantee it. He said, if it don't work for you, if you don't cut 30 trees, you bring it back tomorrow. I'll give you your money back. So we said, all right. So we bought one of them. We took it out there to the farm. We came back the next day. We was upset. He said, what's the matter? I said, we only cut 3 trees with that thing. We worked all day and only cut 3 trees. He said, well, maybe something's wrong with it. Can I see it for a second? We handed it to him, and he pulled this little thing on it, and it went. We both said, what's that noise? Now, while we was there, we was there in Elevated Mattress, Arkansas, like I said. Well, the next town over is a little town called Albany. I always heard it was called Albany, like Albany, New York. Well, Jim Bob said he'd always heard that the locals called it Albany. And I said, no, it's Albany. He said, no, I'm telling you, it's Albany. So about that time, we was driving over there. We was going to stop to get something to eat. I said, I tell you what. I said, let's just ask them in here. I said, they're locals. They'll know how to pronounce it, you know. So we went into the restaurant. And I went up to the old boy at the counter there, and I said, hey, can you tell us where we're at right now? And I said, can you say it real slow so my cousin can understand you? He said, sure. Dairy Queen. Speaking of Dairy Queen, I'll tell you what, you may notice I got a little bit of extra poundage going on here. I've been working on trying to get that off. It's not easy, though. I'll tell you what, if you've ever tried to diet, you know it's not an easy thing. I went to the doctor. He told me, he said, Leroy, you're going to have to get some of that weight off. He said, I'm going to have you start keeping a food journal. Well, I didn't know what a food journal was. I said, what's that? He said, well, I want you to write down in a little notepad what you eat every day. He said, for example, what'd you have for, what'd you eat yesterday? I said, well, let's see. I said, I had some eggs and some sausage and bacon and toast and grits and biscuits and gravy and pancakes and waffles and coffee and orange juice and milk. He said, goodness, Leroy. And I said, well, wait a minute. I said, then I had roast beef and mashed potatoes and some fried chicken and a half apple pie. He said, Leroy. And I said, wait, I ain't done yet. I said, then I had some beef stew and some chili and the other half of the apple pie. He said, you mean to tell me you ate that all in one day? I said, no, that was just for breakfast. Then for lunch I had